There's a certain charm in watching a series change and evolve throughout its lifespan, integrating new and seemingly risky additions, all the while hopefully improving upon what worked in the past. Not every game has this charm, as some titles end up radically different from their predecessors, but that's what makes it all the more fun when you can see the clear through line from title to title and feel the improvements being made as the series continues. I've got plenty of examples of this, ranging from Metal Gear to Yakuza to Kingdom Hearts, but for the topic of today's video, this game went above and beyond a simple through line, as it integrated everything that worked about its previous entries, all the while giving itself a distinctive edge that allowed it to stand apart from its predecessors. If you have the ability to read above a second grade level, which I hope everyone watching this video has, you know I'm talking about Metroid Dread, the newest mainline 2D Metroid game to hit the market after a near 11-year drought, if you don't count the remake or spin-off related releases. Now, if you've been following the channel, you know that I was not a fan of Metroid prior to Dread's announcement, but nevertheless, I was interested enough in what I saw in Dread to take the plunge into the 2D side of the Metroid series, and just as quickly as I entered, I immediately got sucked in. Starting off with Zero Mission, I grew an immense appreciation for how Metroid would provide its world building and storytelling with as little dialogue as possible, and even though that would eventually change with Fusion, the surprisingly strong narrative beats each title had kept me too interested to mind the change of spoken dialogue. I became a Metroid fan in the lead up to playing Dread, and to the surprise of no one, it heavily affected my enjoyment of the game. Not only was I able to spot the little improvements Mercury's team managed to make to Dread, turning it into what I believe to be the definitive 2D Metroid title from a gameplay perspective, but I stood at awe at the other changes they made along the way. Not only were they able to incorporate the amazing minimalism of the early Metroid titles, but they blended it in so well with the narrative focus Fusion introduced that it feels effortless in how the game goes back and forth between the two styles. I enjoy Metroid Dread a lot, as at the time of writing this, I've beaten the game at least 5 or 6 times trying to see everything the game has to offer. And in that time, I realized something important about the game. While being a fantastic sequel to Fusion, Dread is a lot more than that, as it goes above and beyond to bring Metroid back into the modern day, serving as more of an evolution of the series, an intense one at that, as the narrative wasn't the only inspiration Dread got from Fusion, but more on that later. For now, let's cut the small talk and dive right into Metroid Dread. The story begins by recapping the events of the past games, telling how Samus single-handedly wiped out both the X and their natural predators, the Metroids, before showing that despite Samus' efforts at the end of Fusion, there are still X running around, as the Galactic Federation was sent a video of the parasite floating about. After confirming that the video was real, the Galactic Federation sent a squad of specialized research robots, also known as the EMI, to gather DNA samples and report back to the Federation, but as soon as they touched down, they lost all contact with the EMI, forcing them to call on Samus to visit the video the planet originated from, ZDR, so she can put a stop to the X's potential tirade. If you're wondering why Samus is still working for the Galactic Federation, apparently there was a huge mistranslation in Fusion, where instead of the whole Galactic Federation being against her, it was one person who wanted to capture the X, which makes a lot more sense as why she can trust them. Anyways, as Samus enters ZDR's atmosphere, Adam tries to get her to bow out, saying that the bounty for this mission seems to be insufficient, but Samus carries on anyways, more than likely being driven by her past experience with the X, wanting to eradicate them before they can cause any major damage. As Samus dives into the underground of ZDR, we see a Chozo just hanging around. For anyone not in the know, the Chozo are the race of alien space birds that created Samus' power suit and raised her when she was a child, which was an aspect of the game set I should have mentioned in a previous video. However, you never see the Chozo in present time, as you instead read about them and experience a breath of their work through Samus, but for the longest period of time, they were assumed to be extinct when clearly that's not the case. As Samus gets closer, the Chozo starts shooting at her, causing the two to scuffle about. While Samus puts up a fight, the Chozo suit ends up being a hard nut to crack, allowing him to get the upper hand on Samus until something happens. When Samus awakens, the Chozo is nowhere in sight, alongside most of her power, somehow getting stripped of it while she was unconscious. After running around the planet, she then runs into a malfunctioning EMI that decides to target Samus, but due to the EMI's armor, Samus is, and for the rest of the game will be, incapable of hurting it, forcing her to run. But after coming across a brain that's just there, Samus absorbs its power and receives the Omega Blaster, giving her the ability to take out the EMI by shooting its core. While the threat is neutralized, the journey has only begun, as Samus would end up passing through a strange door, which holds another EMI to encounter, who's fully operational, as despite not knowing where Samus is, it's able to track her down and move at ridiculous speeds to her. After reaching the navigation room, Samus gets in contact with Adam, who attempts to shed some light on some things, saying that the EMI have the ability to echolocate their target, which combined with their speed, armor, and ability to shut down doors when they've locked onto you make them a huge threat. However, they're only permitted to move within their assigned zones thanks to the central unit, which was the brain Samus absorbed earlier. But with her one method of defending herself being a weapon she can't always access, he advises her that her primary concern when she enters into an enemy door is to survive. This is where the game leaves you to your own devices, allowing you to explore the 8 zones of ZDR as you attempt to make your great escape from this nightmare. Throughout the journey, you'll be using all of Samus's familiar power-ups to make the trek bearable, like the various suit screw attack, plasma beam, and so on. And while these old abilities are great, they pale in comparison to the parry, which got upgraded from its incarnation in Samus Returns, as you can now run while using it, and even if you don't hit the parry window, you can still do damage to enemies, outright killing some of the weaker variety. And on top of that, the average health and damage of the enemies have been reduced in Samus Returns, meaning that you don't have to rely solely on the parry for the early section of Dread, making regular beam shots viable again. But despite those amazing changes, even those pale in comparison to the changes made to the general controls, in which Metroid Dread is quite possibly the best 2D game I have ever played in my life. While past Metroid games didn't control bad by any stretch of the imagination, Dread feels super smooth to do even the most basic movement options in, like running back and forth. There's just such a flow about everything Samus can do that makes the game a blast to run through. The control is also something that gets highlighted a lot more in repeat playthroughs, as when you manage to clear a room without stopping, it gives off the same kind of feeling of going fast in a Sonic game. I don't think I could ever properly explain how good the movement in this game feels. If at any point it looks like I'm effortlessly strolling through an area having the time of my life, trust me when I say it feels even better than it looks. The new movement even translates into old upgrades like the Shine Spark, which in past games had numerous puzzles. However, because there was a small margin of error regarding the inputs you needed to get the puzzle right, I never found myself actively going after them, and if I ever got one, it was by complete accident. But now, in addition to the inputs being a lot more lenient, some of the Shine Spark puzzles play off Dread's smooth feel to give some of the coolest looking puzzle solutions in the series. And speaking of puzzles, the ones in Dread are great, as not only do they have a wide breadth of them to complete, but a lot of them have multiple solutions to them, leaving it very open as to how you finish them. In fact, some of these puzzles are so open that you can obtain abilities before the game even gives you the proper weapon to use them with. Once again, sequence breaking comes into the limelight, and while Dread does highlight its flexible design and the smaller ammunition pickups you can get throughout the game, it also shows off by allowing you to sequence break boss fights, revealing special death animations tailored for said boss. Now, even though I said animations, the only boss that gets any kind of fanfare for breaking it in two is Kraid, who, if you manage to get the grapple beam early, will allow you to access the hidden hole in the wall so you can rocket yourself into Kraid, recreating the ending of Metroid 2. I was floored, seeing that not only was there an intentional sequence break, but how much of the game was designed around said sequence break in the first place. As on many playthroughs, I wondered why there were grapple beam sections outside of certain doorways, making it impossible to traverse through early on, only for it to now make sense after pursuing the skip. Now, even though the rest of the bosses don't have that much flair put into them, don't let that discourage you from getting creative, as this time around, the boss rooms themselves are built wider than normal, allowing you to incorporate some creative uses of speed booster to get quicker kills. It's stuff like this which makes revisiting Dread such a blast, as Mercury's team managed to innovate on boss design, giving Dread a distinct openness in its fights, which suddenly encourages experimentation, which gets particularly highlighted by the boss rush mode, which requires that you think outside the box in order to take each boss down within the allotted time. And speaking of bosses, not only are all the bosses in Dread easily the best in the entire series, but they are also the hardest ones to boot. While Dread doesn't have Samus Return's large damage issue, these bosses are still quite the challenge, as their unique attack patterns can have you eating dirt in an instant. Kraid in particular was a boss that gave me a lot of problems when I first started playing, mostly because my R button on my Joy-Con was sticky at the time, so I was dealing less damage to him per second and forced to use a charge beam. But despite the unintended challenge run, beating Kraid and the rest of the bosses felt immensely satisfying, as the challenge they provided made learning their patterns and eventually learning to clown on them made victory all the sweeter. Another reason why it was so satisfying was because the cutscenes for the Kraid fight were amazing. No dialogue is exchanged between the two, and yet Samus's body language does all the talking for you, as she first tenses up when Kraid gets into view, only to then relax when she sees he's chained up, and then casually says hello by shooting him in the mouth. Cutscene direction direction is another aspect of Dread that I really got to applaud Mercury's team for, because in my mind, this was such an easy aspect of the game to mess up, and yet they managed to knock every single cutscene out of the park, with hands down the best part about all these cutscenes being Mercury's team's portrayal of Samus. True to how she was portrayed in Fusion, Samus keeps to herself for a majority of the game, only speaking when she absolutely needs to, which barely even takes up a full 10 seconds of the game's total runtime. Other than that, from beginning to end, she is completely quiet when interacting with the world of ZDR, letting her body do the talking for her, and it is done so well. I cannot stress enough how much Samus's movements sell her every emotion, as you can tell exactly when she's stressed, calm, or confused, allowing you to easily pick up on what she's going through mentally. But if that weren't enough, most of the cutscenes are framed with her eyes being completely unreadable to the audience. If you're wondering why that's important, it's because the eyes are the gateway to the soul, and even if a character can't speak, simply looking at their eyes will give you enough information to tell how they feel. But Mercury's team purposely made it difficult on themselves by covering Samus's eyes in a majority of Dread's cutscenes, which just adds onto how amazing Samus's body language is portrayed. I honestly can't give enough praise to Mercury's team for how Samus came out in these cutscenes, as, in my opinion, she was perfectly translated from Metroid's past titles and spun forward in a way that I personally couldn't have imagined being possible in a game with multiple dedicated cutscenes. And while I'm not exactly an aficionado on silent protagonists, as they are, when handled poorly, my least favorite characters to follow in a video game, I think Samus in Dread can be a golden example of how to do a silent protagonist right, or rather, a partially silent protagonist right, and show how to sell their emotions through their actions. Of course, this also assumes that every game dev moving forward want to create silent protagonists with personalities and not blank slates for you to insert yourself into, but I digress. Moving on from that, we now enter into the major mechanic of Metroid Dread, the Emmy. As we touched upon earlier, they can't be harmed with anything but the Omega Blaster, and later on, the Omega Stream, as unlike the first Emmy, the others have functioning armor that will need to be broken in order to get to their core. But until you get to that point, you'll be going through, in essence, a stealth section that's pretty competently made. In addition to the Emmy's own general mechanics, the further you travel into the game, the more things you'll find lying around to help them out, like little robots whose whole deal is to explode and let the Emmy know where you are, pressure plates that will block your path, magma doors which slowly open, giving the Emmy a chance to catch you, and so on and so forth. That's not even mentioning the other abilities that the Emmys have, as later on they'll start using familiar powers like the Speed Booster, Ice Beam, and Wave Beam in addition to their echolocation, becoming an even bigger threat the more you defeat. But to give you a hand, the game throws you a bone in the sound design by cueing you in if an Emmy is in the same room as you by playing robotic beeps and boops, which generally means that you need to proceed with caution. However, if an enemy locks onto your location, the music becomes a lot more sinister and frantic, which spurs the other mechanics of the room to come into play. The enemy have an interesting cat and mouse dynamic with Samus that'll make your first time through a fun, yet stressful time. This being replicated in the rumble feature, where if you're near an enemy and it hasn't spotted you, your control will start vibrating, indicating Samus' heart kicked into overdrive. But I will say, after your first time through, you will naturally lower the enemy's threat level, as the biggest thing to overcome in an enemy section is direction, as there are tons of dead ends that will eventually set you up to encounter an enemy, or set something off that will lead the enemy to you. However, once you know where all these things are, it becomes very easy to bolt through a room with minimal interaction with the enemy, if at all. This isn't really a complaint, more so just me pointing out the obvious, as it's similar to fighting a hard boss in your first playthrough, then curb stomping it on your second. The boss didn't get any easier, you just got better and learned what to do and not do. With that being said, I really like the Emmy, as their initially unbeatable nature makes it satisfying to turn the tables around when you eventually get access to the Omega Blaster. But if that weren't enough, the game throws you another bone with the returning Aeon powers, particularly the Phantom Cloak, which acts as a stealth mode so long as you have Aeon meter to burn, muffling all the sounds you make unless you use a beam. However, if you run out of Aeon meter, it's not the end of the world, as the Phantom Cloak will instead drain your energy tanks until you have only one unit left. At that point, the cloaking wears off, which sounds like a big problem, but considering how many energy tanks are littered throughout the game, alongside the fact that getting hit by the enemy is a one-hit kill, it's more than a fair cost for the Phantom Cloak to be your health bar. In addition, the Aeon meter has changed significantly, as now it refills over time instead of needing to parry enemies, which is nice because you'll likely be in the same room as the enemy when you use it. But of course, the Phantom Cloak isn't all there is to Dread, as there's also Flash Shift and Scan Radar, with the former being a defensive ability used to get away from the opponent, while the latter is Scan Pulse again, which, to be fair, is a really useful ability that I'm glad they kept in, but learned from Samus Returns and plays it towards the tail end of the game. That way you aren't capping exploration in the knees from hour 1. In addition to that, Dread also adds in highlighted areas on the map that'll tell an item's general location. And man, I cannot tell you how pivotal this addition was for me getting 100% in Dread, as running around looking for 1 to 2 items that I missed is never fun in a game this open. It's funny, but despite Scan Pulse oftentimes being better in terms of finding things, I rarely if ever use it because the highlights were more than enough to get me thinking. That, and powerbombing a general area is a nice way to uncover all the hidden details regardless of whether or not it works. Flash Shift, on the other hand, being a two-way ground or air dash, is more situational, being used specifically for fights or to get items. Now, I just want to say, to whoever made this move, you did a good job. While its use is maybe a bit niche, I can't tell you how good it is to use Flash Shift. There are so many situations that you can completely bypass with Flash Shift that it's ridiculous. Even some enemy encounters are just not a problem with this move, as you can literally leave. And man, when you get the space jump and use Flash Shift, dude, I don't know, but it somehow feels even better to perform as you leave the opposition in the dust. But by far, the best part about Aeon powers this time is the fact that they aren't stepping on each other's toes. Because of their specific niche uses, you won't activate stealth mode in a fight, although you can do it and get some use out of it, nor will you activate the scan radar when trying to avoid an enemy. The only Aeon ability that is flexible enough to be used in multiple situations is Flash Shift, thanks to it doubling as an air dash, so you can rocket yourself through enemy rooms if you know they aren't waiting for you on the other side. A lot of what I mentioned was more than enough to carry me through my first 3 playthroughs, but what sprang me into my most recent 2 were completion rewards, which are unlockable extras by beating Dread within a certain amount of hours or by getting 100% completion. Now, as for the other rewards, you have to beat the game in under 4 hours in both normal and hard mode, in which, by doing so, you get newly drawn pieces of art for every 2D entry, but the final reward for getting them all in one save file is too good, honestly. It's easily my favorite piece of Metroid related art, and serves as a really cool Zero Suit Samus reward, which is normally the first and only reward you get for beating the game in under 4 hours. Because of all this optional stuff, I ended up doing just about everything in Dread with the exception of speedrunning it. Dread has been nothing short of an absolute blast for the last 6 months, and that's in no short part thanks to its story as well, which now that I've exhausted just about everything I could say about the gameplay, I should probably get back into it as well. After traversing her way up through the EDR, taking out Emmy after Emmy, Samus would find herself standing in front of a Chozo hieroglyph that depicts the bird from earlier, which sets her off. And in the middle of Samus's rage, she's hit through the hieroglyph by an Emmy, who despite having her in its grasp, stops short of attacking her, as another Chozo approaches in its place. This Chozo's name is Quiet Robe, and he's here to exposit on what happened in ZDR, saying that the other Chozo on this rock is named Ravenbeak. Sure and to the point, Ravenbeak loved the power that the Metroids had and wanted to use them to take over the galaxy no matter what kind of opposition he got from his own people. However, not every Chozo on the planet was okay with galactic domination, leading Ravenbeak to wipe out an entire tribe known as the Thoha. However, because the Thoha had the ability to control Metroids, he left one of them alive so that he can see his plans reach their full potential, with that Thoha being Quiet Robe. After Ravenbeak's uprising, he took a platoon to SR-388 to scout the area, but didn't realize on the return trip he picked up an X-Parasite which managed to wipe out almost all the Chozo on ZDR. By the time Ravenbeak managed to contain the X, when he went back to SR-388, he had found that the Metroids had already been eradicated, with the only surviving piece of Metroid DNA left being within Samus. As such, Ravenbeak's plan is to use the Emmy to extract Samus's DNA and clone her to create an army of the strongest warrior in the galaxy. Quiet Robe then tells Samus that he deactivated the remaining Emmy, and continues on by saying that she can't let herself get caught by Ravenbeak, to which Samus, in the only speaking role she has in Dread, tells him not to worry. Quiet Robe then gets shot in the back by a Chozo robot, causing Samus to throw down with it. Unfortunately, the shot was lethal, taking away the one friendly person Samus met on ZDR. Eventually, through continuing her trek through ZDR, Samus would come across a Lun, an old Chozo hideaway that upon further inspection also houses the ex Ravenbeak captured. While Samus manages to beat them back, she finds that the door that locked itself on her way in is now wide open, allowing the X to roam free and take control of every living organism on ZDR. This shows itself in gameplay by not only giving the inhabitants of ZDR a new color palette, but also giving them much stronger moves and even allowing them to take even more hits than the original counterparts. The X once again are a major threat. However, what got me this time around was not how different they were from the originals, but how invested I was at this point. I know I already mentioned this when talking about previous games, but I'm still amazed at how little dialogue there is and yet how much I care despite that. Anyways, thanks to one of the X coming into contact with Quiet Robe, that X uses its knowledge to reactivate the Emmy, which if that weren't bad enough, one of them has echolocation so good it can track Samus the second she steps into an Emmy door. It also has the ability to see through walls and has the wave beam to boot. You know, just in case you didn't think it was powerful enough. Eventually, after reaching ZDR's surface, Hanubia, Samus comes across a cloning facility where one of the creatures breaks free and attacks Samus. While she effortlessly parries it, Samus has to stop herself from throttling the thing with her hand and instead use her beam. Samus then briefly contemplates what that feeling was before continuing on anyways. That is until she reaches the Emmy door and gets hit with the power bomb Emmy, who gets ready to extract Samus's DNA. That is until Samus starts absorbing its energy instead. Finally starting to understand what that thing is, she then takes on one of the X parasites posing as a Chozo warrior, and for the finishing blow she uses that new ability to absorb the X, regenerating all of her health and ammo. With that, it becomes clear that this ability stemmed from the baby Metroid's DNA, allowing her to absorb the creatures she touches and turn them into pure energy. Or, in other words, Samus Aran is a Metroid. This was such a cool twist that I'm honestly still in shock by it. After all these games, the most terrifying power that is used by the Metroids is now a weapon that you yourself can use in specific boss fights. Unfortunately, the absorption power isn't something that you can just do with regular enemies, which kinda sucks because, you know, the past 20 years of gaming was trying to get away from these cutscene powers being untranslatable to gameplay. I feel that a different parry animation that heals you a slight bit more, or having a super meter that you build up to would have sufficed for this, but I digress. After coming to this realization, Samus then gets into contact with Adam, who starts theorizing that thanks to Samus possessing the Thoha genes, she was able to keep the Metroid DNA at bay. However, thanks to Ravenbeak being a particular breed of Chozo that the Metroids were programmed to see as their enemies called the Makin, it ended up taking away the control she had and began speeding up the process ever since. Because of this, Adam tells Samus that in her current state, she is a threat to the entire galaxy. But if she follows his orders, then everything will be fine as they'll bring order to the galaxy. Thinking this sounds quite auspicious, Samus destroys the navigation room, only to reveal that Ravenbeak was sitting right behind it, who has been talking to Samus in Adam's place ever since she first dropped unconscious. This twist actually caught me a bit off guard, as honestly, even when looking back at all the wording, nothing that Ravenbeak says is too far off from what Adam would say. That is, except for one very important word, being lady. It is the one thing that Ravenbeak wouldn't say, as you know, why would he? After realizing he didn't say that one word, it became a lot easier to see Ravenbeak cracking through, which is funny because he tries to come off as pessimistic whenever he talks about Samus's chance about going up against him. However, in actuality, it's just Ravenbeak gassing himself up the whole time, which is just too funny not to laugh at. Anyways, Ravenbeak then says he's disappointed in his daughter, showing a flashback where Ravenbeak ended up using his DNA to integrate Samus into the Chozo fold, turning this boss fight into a family feud. If I know any better, I'd say the fight against Ravenbeak was made for me, as not only is it a rival fight in which he uses similar abilities, if not the exact same abilities as Samus using Flash Shift and Shine Spark, but he also uses some of her older abilities like Beam Burst and even has some of Ridley's dive attacks as well. But on top of all of that, the first cutscene where these two square off actually serves as a bit of a tutorial to this fight, as everything Samus does in the beginning you're supposed to mimic in order to avoid Ravenbeak's attacks. This detail is so cool and something that I can't get over. However, my favorite detail about this fight, at least in the early phase, is that Ravenbeak starts taunting you, which is just perfect, as with the two of them being evenly matched, he starts taunting more as a lure, but it's no use, as thanks to the parry you can stop most of his physical attacks. At every turn, Ravenbeak managed to surprise me, constantly challenging my knowledge of the game and pushing me to my limit. But when it's all said and done, Samus gets Ravenbeak on his back leg and attempts to embrace her inner Metroid and go for a head attack, but Ravenbeak stops her just before she can make contact. Ravenbeak then starts gloating, thanking Samus for bringing herself to him so that he can now clone the most powerful Metroid in existence, and tells her that now it's time for her to go to sleep. Samus' suit then powers down, only to then reactivate with the Metroid DNA, using her power to reach Ravenbeak's head, sucking the power out of not only him, but the ship itself, taking them down to Hanubia. However, despite having a Metroid attack him, Ravenbeak is still kicking. but not for long, as an X takes over his body, turning him into Crid with Ravenbeak's head. While big, Samus's newfound power is much greater, taking it down in one continuous charge beam shot, which somehow or another activates a self-destruct timer, forcing Samus to bolt out of ZDR before it blows up. This is the only section in the game where you can play as Samus with a Metroid power suit, which, don't get me wrong, the Metroid power suit is cool, but I already voiced my qualms with not having stuff like this being fully playable during regular gameplay, so I'll move on for the time being. As Samus reaches her ship, the real Adam tells her not to touch anything, as she'll absorb the power from the ship and leave herself stranded. But that's when the X of Quiet Robe appears in Samus' ship and offers the Thoha genes in it to her, returning her back to normal as she rockets out of ZDR, ending the game. And that was Metroid Dread, probably one of the best games I've ever played in my life, and an amazing step forward for Metroid games as a whole. While the ending does make me raise an eyebrow, and why exactly the X decided to give its life up for Samus, I think in terms of gameplay and storytelling, it knocks it out of the park, becoming the Metroid game, at least for me. Even as I write this, I'm still in awe with how well this game was put together, which only goes to show how talented the Devs at Mercury's team are. Metroid Dread is my game of 2022 that came out in 2021. I just can't get enough of this game, nor can I get over how good it all is. So, long story short, Metroid Dread is amazing. It's an intense and ambitious title that evolved Metroid to a level I couldn't previously perceive. And after now finally playing it, I think I'm more excited to see an eventual sequel to Dread than I am Metroid Prime 4. Because after what Mercury's team showed they could do in this game, I know that that game will be in very good hands.